Blood Sun is a good Magic the Gathering card. For 3 mana, you draw a card and all lands lose abilities except mana abilities. This means all fetch lands now cannot be activated to find a land, and cards like Urza Saga get wrecked because they are instantly sacrificed when Blood Sun is put into play. Now, while that is good value, we are going to be playing Lotus Field alongside this enchantment to get a lot of mana, as not only do you not have to sacrifice lands, it also enters the battlefield untapped. Now of course, we're going to be playing the 2 best elementals in the red-white colors, and alongside them we will buff them with Elish Norn to double the triggers for not only these elementals, but also every value card in our deck. If you do doubt this strategy, it did 5-0 a recent league on Magic Online, which is how I discovered this list, and if you want to get a cyber guide for the deck, it'll be up on my Patreon right now. To start the first match of this video, we have to mulligan a clunky opening 7 and keep a decent 6 and bottom Elish Norn. The opponent starts off the game with a Mishra's Bauble and a fetch land, kind of implying that they're on blue-red Murktide. With a Solitude in our draw step, the best thing we can do is play this Ragavan and hope it stays on the table. Things look pretty good when the opponent just fetches a tap Steam Vents, plays an Otawara, and passes back the turn, so we're just hoping they don't have a Lightning Bolt in our combat step. With the Flagstones off the top, we just got to attack with the Ragavan, and they do have the Lightning Bolt. While that is unfortunate, we did find a Flagstones of Trokier in our draw step, which is amazing because this is the only land in our deck that we can sacrifice for value, because when it goes to the graveyard, we can search our library for our planes and put it onto the battlefield. While we were talking about the amazing Flagstone, the opponent just played a land and passed back, so we're just going to do the same thing, but this time we get a bit of value with our Flagstone. The opponent spends 2 mana on a Ledger Shredder and holds up 2 mana on our turn when they pass back. With an Inspiring Vantage off the top, let's try and go for a Solitude on their end step to waste this 2 mana here. To start off the opponent's turn, they play an Expressive Iteration, which finds a monkey. They cast the Ragavan, they do Connive and discard a Mishra's Bauble, and instantly go to the combat step. I decide to cast the Solitude because if they do have Counterspell, then at least they won't Connive again, and if they don't have Counterspell, then I prevent the damage, which is what happens. Suspiciously, the opponent yet again passes back with 2 open mana, so here with the Blood Sun off the top, I'm going to cast that and then maybe cast the Seasoned Pyromancer, depending on what they do. Now the opponent casts a Spell Pierce, so I'm obviously going to pay, and they have a second Spell Pierce to make sure my Blood Sun doesn't hit the table. I don't want to attack, I'd rather block the Ragavan, but they have a Ledger Shredder, Consider, and then an Unholy Heat to make sure the Ragavan connects, which finds a March of Otherworldly Light. Now they can't do anything with that, so they pass back, and I'm going to Solitude in my main phase here, because while they could have Counterspell in hand, they can't Connive if they cast it, and they have to sacrifice the treasure to do so. After sacrificing the Fiery Islet, they have a Dragon Rage Channeler, and a Blood Moon. Now at first, this seems really good against my deck, because you stop the Lotus Field from tapping for 3 mana, but in actuality, while we did draw a lot of Solitudes this game, most of the cards in our deck are red. So with a Lightning Bolt off the top, we can now do a lot of work. I decide to attack him with a Solitude to see if they'll block, which they obviously don't, so I bolt the Dragon Rage Channeler and play the Fable. While I was debating in my head should I block the Ragavan or not, the opponent just concedes the game. Sideboarding in this matchup is super simple, 3 Relic of Progenitus, and just take out 3 cards that you think are pretty weak. Now going into game 2, we have a great opening hand with Relic of Progenitus, Lightning Bolt, and 2 Furies, so when the opponent starts off the game with Dragon Rage Channeler, we're going to Lightning Bolt that, and have Prismatic Ending for turn 2 if they do have that Ledger Shredder. You could say that Christmas has come early in March, so now we're going to Prismatic Ending this Ledger Shredder. With the second Relic of Progenitus off the top, our sideboarding is paying off by obviously bringing in Graveyard Hate against the Graveyard deck and drawing them. Something that's even funnier here is the opponent plays Blood Moon again, but we don't care about Blood Moon because every card in our deck is red. Okay, sure, here we top deck a Solitude, which is a bit rough, but as soon as we draw another white card, then we are actually out of the mana screw from the Blood Moon, or we can draw something like Ragavan to make treasures, or even Fable of the Mirror Breaker to make treasures, or something like Seasoned Pyromancer to loot away the Solitude. So we have many ways to work around the quote-unquote mana screw here. The opponent does have an Expressive Iteration into a land and a Dragon Rage Channeler, so on their end step I decide to sacrifice one of the Relic of Progenitus just to make sure that I hit my land drops. Now we did find a Seasoned Pyromancer off the top of the deck, so let's use that to loot away the Solitude and also make a load of creatures, because this Dragon Rage Channeler is going to be a 1-1 for a very long time. I'm going to speed up the rest of this game because the opponent was just locked out of the game with the Blood Moon on the table. They didn't have enough blue mana to counter or have enough counters up for the things that I was casting, And when the opponent was holding up blue mana, I held up activated abilities of other cards like Seasoned Pyromancer, or putting my companion to hand, or just casting things on their turn. They eventually lost the game and conceded. Now, we did beat Blue-Red Murktide, which is great, but I got paired against it again. I lost the first game against Blue-Red Murktide because they had 2 Murktide Regents quite quickly after disrupting me a lot. Then in the second game, we managed to win because of 2 Furies and the opponent not having access to a lot of counterspells. After the opponent played a load of blockers, we dashed a Ragavan and actually found a Lightning Bolt off the top of their deck in order to cast it to face and win the game. But in the third game, we sadly just couldn't get there. While we did almost mana screw them by only disrupting 1 Flooded Strand with the Blood Sun, it did a lot of work, but after they found a Murktide and assembled a big board against my no cards in hand, we lost the match. Despite losing a game 3 against a good Murktide player, I still thought that this deck was very strong. After losing another very close game 3 against a Fires of Invention Taking Turns deck, I then beat a Gruul Underworld Breach deck to leave me at 2 wins and 2 losses going into the final round. While this hand isn't the best in the world, having both a Fable of the Mirrorbreaker, a Blood Sun, and a Lotus Field was enticing enough for me to keep and to see what would happen. After leading with an Arid Mesa, the opponent gets a Blood Crypt and plays a Dragon Rage Channeler. But like an absolute beast, I find the Lightning Bolt off the top so we can remove that and keep the opponent honest. I think there's a new bug on Magic Online called the Lightning Bolt bug because the opponent instantly follows up with a Dragon Rage Channeler and a Shadow Spear to Surveil 1. It's now time to slam this Blood Sun as we find an Arid Mesa off the top, and with the opponent playing Shadow Spear in their deck, that must mean they play Urza's Saga, because why else would you play Shadow Spear? Now let's look at the opponent's graveyard just for 2 seconds. If you see, the opponent has an Urza's Saga instantly go to the graveyard because it is instantly sacrificed when put into play when you have Blood Sun on the table. Now surprisingly, the opponent has nothing left to do but equip Shadow Sphere to the Dragon Rage Channeler and attack in. Now with a Ragavan off the top, we can play our Lotus Field untapped, but first let's dash this Ragavan to see what they have on top of their deck. And we find an Inquisition of Kozilek. Now we can play our Lotus Field, tap it for black mana, cast the Inquisition, and then follow up with Fable of the Mirrorbreaker without having to sacrifice our treasure. Now we do see a load of cards. Any card we pick here will give the Dragon Rage Channeler Delirium, so I'm going to take the Unholy Heat because it does the most damage and I want my Elesh Norn to stay around. After making a Fable token, the opponent attacks in for 4 with Dragon Rage Channeler, follows up with a Ragavan, and holds up their Fatal Push. Now I loot away my Elesh Norn and the useless Blood Sun, and can get in with the Goblin token to make a treasure. They thought for a while if they want to push my Goblin token, which they don't, so then I marched the Dragon Rage Channeler, and I was going to cast the Ragavan, but then I realized they are obviously holding Fatal Push for my Ragavan, so let's try and waste their mana, and they do let me waste their mana. The reason why I have an emphasis on wasting mana for the opponent here is because when we looked at their hand, they had all 1 mana removal spells, and when they don't cast that Fatal Push and have a second one in hand, they can only limit themselves to 1 push a turn. So if I always play a creature that they don't want to Fatal Push, then I'll keep wasting their mana, and eventually they will have to Fatal Push the bad creatures, which is why I'm actually surprised they never Fatal Pushed anyways. Now something interesting here is that Elesh Norn does not double Fable of the Mirrorbreaker's Chapter 1, and that's actually because it's not an Enter the Battlefield trigger. When Fable of the Mirrorbreaker enters the battlefield, it comes into play with 1 Saga counter, which then makes you do the first chapter. Now logically it makes sense that it's not an Enter the Battlefield trigger, you put the counter on for the Saga, but I'm not a judge and I don't know the actual ruling, so if you are a judge, let us know in the comment section what is the actual reason for why Elesh Norn does not double Fable. Going into boarding, we want all the artifact and enchantment hate from our sideboard into the deck, as well as Magus of the Moon to stop the Urza's Saga. Things I board out is Ephemerate because they have a load of removal spells, Ragavan's a bit weak against all their construct tokens, and Elesh Norn seemed not great because they didn't have many Enter the Battlefield triggers. Being on the draw game 2, we have a great opening hand with a turn 1 Ragavan and a turn 1 removal spell, depending on what we want to do. And with the opponent playing a Ragavan turn 1, we just got a Prismatic Ending and hope that they don't have good follow-up. But their follow-up is pretty good, and that's a Tarmogoyf, which is going to be awkward for us to remove because we don't actually have a lot of mana right now. So with a Spikefield Hazard off the top, I'm just going to play that tapped because we do need lands in play before we can play Lotus Field, which we will have to sacrifice some cards. Now we did board out Ragavan for a reason, and it's because it's bad in spots like these because they just Unholy Heat my creature and get in with a massive Tarmogoyf. but with a Flagstones of Trocheair off the top, now we can kill this Tarmogoyf and also set up for our Lotus Field next turn. Now the opponent seems to disagree with me setting up with Lotus Field because they play Alpine Moon naming Lotus Field, which I think is a massive mistake, because I haven't played Lotus Field yet and sacrificed lands, and if I do have it in hand, now it's an untapped land. So after they attack in, I was planning on playing my Lotus Field and then marching the Alpine Moon, but because we whiffed our draw step and drew another land, I'd rather put Obosh into my hand to set up for next turn, and even set up for marching the Gigantha because we are going to lose to damage if they have a load of power on the board. The opponent yet again gets a land, plays their Gigantha, and then attacks in for 1. What's unfortunate here, though, is we whiff our draw step again, so we can't march the Alpine Moon and get value from all these Lotus Fields, because obviously we have to deal with the Gigantha. So I think the best play here is to just slam the Obosh and hope that we can block and they don't find a discard spell so we can set up for this march down the line. Oh, okay, they find a Thoughtseize. The opponent obviously takes the march, they get Delirium with the Dragon Rage Channeler, and have the last card in hand, Urza Saga, to bash me down to 6. With a Fable of the Mirror Breaker off the top though, we can now cast that and hold up the Iganjo because it does get discounted for having a legendary creature in play. So with Saga taking up to 2, and the opponent bashing in with the board, we can now kill the Dragon Rage Channeler and also chump the Gigantha. Now they have a Dragon Rage Channeler to follow up with, but we find a Solitude off the top. So now we can loot away the Sacred Foundry, which finds a Ragavan, and we can force them to chump with the Dragon Rage Channeler, because we can now attack in with our Obosh, Solitude the token that they make with the Saga, and then they have to chump with the Dragon Rage Channeler, and we have the Ragavan to follow up with to chump block the Gigantha. The opponent seems to be low on options because they make a Construct token, get a Shadow Spear with the Urza Saga, and equip it to the Gigantha. As the Obosh doubles the damage from all of our creatures that are odd converted mana cost, we can now trade with the Gigantha, and they follow up with the Saga. They re-equip the token, but with a March of Otherworldly Light off the top, we can exile the token, steal their Tarmogoyf, and put them at an almost 100% to lose spot. So overall, we got 3 wins and 2 losses, with both losses being a loss in Game 3, so I am definitely a believer of this deck being decent. As always, I'll open the chest at the end of the video for you gambling degenerates, and don't forget to like and subscribe.